Now I want to turn to the second exercise in the variation in IMRD chapter and look at this body in the loop study. Before I do that, I want to talk about anxiety for a moment. My goal here is to really get you at the right level of anxiety. So there should be some anxiety because I want you to appreciate that this is hard and that we have very high expectations of you. But I don't want this anxiety to be crippling or to limit you or for you to be filled with fear, because lots of tutors have gone through this and you get up to speed much more quickly than you would expect. And I also want to offer that if you feel like you're not getting something or it's just not clicking for you, please send me an email and we can meet in my office and kind of go over and look and talk about these till they click for you. Now, with this body in the loop study, we already read the abstract and went through it in the earlier exercise. So the goal is to look at the headings in here and kind of see what sections they belong to. So heading number 1 is introduction, and this goes for about 2 pages till the end of the second page. I'm probably going to have you look at this in a little bit more detail for next class period for the novelty moves. Then heading 2, which begins at the top of the 3rd page, doesn't clearly correspond to a particular IMRD setting. This is the solution. And this is what I mean when I say that the headings tend to be very topic specific. So first they have a section on, I guess, building the exoskeleton, and they have hardware and the control as subheadings. Then our next main thing that they have is that they developed what seems to be some kind of computer function to get the various parts talking and to enact this gate here. So this is the next part, and this is also part of the solution. So we're still on page 3 here, right? And no, we're on page 4. And so these are some of you start seeing that there's equations, and we're going to see a lot of these. The good news is, for the most part, we don't, like I said in class, we usually aren't getting to these sections of the report. Section 4 here, which says optimization of metabolic effort. Now, I had a little bit of confusion at first when I was looking at this section, but I think that it is still in the ballpark of solution, where they're first describing the methods that they use to figure out what would be the ideal that they use in the evaluation section to compare as a baseline. And then we have lots more, and this is their major contribution, and I can partly tell because it's the longest section here, and because they use the word optimization so much in the abstract. And this is a key part of their solution that goes on for the rest of this section. And then I think we're into about page 7 where we get the experimental evaluation. And this section is where they're testing it and saying how did it perform with real live subjects, with healthy participants, 9 healthy participants who have never used such a device before, or at least half of whom had never used a device like this before. And how did they do? Now, in the results here, if you looked at this closely and found it a little bit confusing, I also found it confusing. And it's interesting, that's also reflected in the abstract, which that sentence was somewhat confusing there. Now, the point that I want you to take is that the solution section started on page 3, continued for 4 or 5 more pages. We have a very short evaluation and then a pretty short discussion and conclusion that takes up the rest of the last page. It differs from the abstract in that the abstract had about half of the abstract dedicated to the problem, and that's because we really need to understand that problem before we can understand the solution. But otherwise, it's similar to the abstract in that the evaluation is very short. So that's kind of what I wanted you to get from this exercise, was to see that a large proportion of this, and what those headings, what I mean by topic-specific headings, that these are kind of specific to this particular project. And the next problem solution paper you see will have very different headings that are specific to that particular project. Now I wanted to take you through Chapter 6 and the exercise that you had to work with here with the novelty moves. And we do spend a lot of time with our clients working on the novelty moves. So between these two introductions, A and B, whenever I do this in workshops, probably I get about 90% of people say B is easier to understand. And B follows these novelty moves pretty clearly. So it begins by saying mapping human motor coordination is central. So the first sentence I see is the significance. The next several sentences from here through here, I would describe as the status quo. You could say that maybe the first one or two sentences is a little bit of background information, but certainly by the end here, we're relying on the status quo and the status quo problem, which is that they rely on brute force designs. And by the last sentence of this paragraph, these experiments are tedious, error-prone, and limited in scope. We're clearly in the gap. These are clearly the problems with the current status quo solution. Status quo way to deal with this. The next paragraph talks about the solution that they develop. It says how they do it and how it is going to overcome the problems. So what this version does is that it clearly describes the significance, the overall significance of the research area, and then it describes the status quo and the problem, what's currently wrong with it, and then the solution and how the solution is going to change the world. By contrast, version A starts off with the solution, and then it explains what problems the solution is solving. And this is very, very common in engineering reports. And what we want to really emphasize to writers is that people will understand your solution better if they understand first what problem it is solving. Now, a lot of our writers are going to say that their rationale for doing it this way is so that it's concise, that right away we get to what it is that they're doing. I try to make the case, and usually pretty successful at making the case, that if we can delay that just a few sentences, more people will understand and will be easier to follow. It will attract a wider audience, and this won't interfere with experts' abilities, and it won't frustrate experts because we're not taking very long to get to the solution. In this plastics example here, this is another problem solution abstract. We again have a statement of the significance. Then we go through the status quo. These are the cutting edge solutions. The first is bioplastic is better than the more common solution of traditional petroleum plastics. And one particularly cutting edge solution is PLA. And then we are focused on the benefits and definition of PLA up until this however. However, the commercial viability of PLA is limited. So the words however and limited are really pointing to the gap, as well as the word only. It's only compostable in industrial facilities and cannot. Another word kind of indicating negativity here. So to make PLA more viable, we propose this solution. And this is also nice. See how they repeat this language here? So the problem is that it's not commercially viable. So to make PLA more commercially viable, and the filling the gap and the solution often really ties very closely to using and repeating the same language as the gap. And this last sentence here is just kind of saying how this will change the world, what it does for society. So these are the moves that I wanted you to see in these introductions.